Yes, Guru. Yes, Guru Maharaj. Srimad Bhagavatam can संसार दावानलीढलोका त्रणाय कारुण्यजनार्दनाथं प्रप्तस्य कल्याण गुणार्णवस्य वन्दे गुरो श्री चरणारविन्दं महाप्रभु कीर्तन नृत्य गीत वादित्रमाद्यान् मनसो रसेन रोमाञ्चकं पशु तरङ्गभाजो वन्दे गुरो श्री चरणारविन्दं श्रीविग्रहाराधननित्यानाना शृङ्गारतन्मन्दिरमार्जनादो युक्तस्य भक्तांश्च नियुञ्जतोऽपि वन्दे गुरो श्री चरणारविन्दं चतुर्विधा श्री भगवत्प्रसाद स्वाद्वानतृप्तान् हरिभक्तसान्ध्यान् कृत्वैव तृप्तिं भजत सदैव वन्दे गुरो श्री चरणारविन्दं श्रीराधिका माधवयोरापारा माधुर्यलीला गुणरूपनाम्नां प्रतिक्षणस्वादनलोलुपस्य वन्दे गुरो श्री चरणारविन्दं निकुञ्जयूनो रतिकेलिसेव्यै यायानिभिर्युक्तेरपेक्षणीया तत्रादिदाक्ष अतिवल्लभस्य वन्दे गुरो श्री चरणारविन्दं साक्षादरीत्वेन समस्तशास्त्रे उक्तस्तथा भाव्यत एव साध्वी किन्तु प्रभोर्यः प्रिय एव तस्य वन्दे गुरो श्री चरणारविन्दं यस्य प्रसादात् भगवत्प्रसादो यस्य प्रसादात् न गति कुतोऽपि ध्यायान् सुवांस्तस्य यशस्वी सङ्गं वन्दे गुरो श्री चरणारविन्दं नमः विष्णुपादाय कृष्णपृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्ति वेदांत स्वामिनिति नामिने नमस्ते सरस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्य देश तारिणे श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंदा श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंदा श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्णा नमस्ते नरसिंहाय प्रहलाद दायिने हिरण्यकाशिपूर्वक्षः शीलटङ्का नखालये इतो नृसिंह परतो नृसिंहो यतो यतो यामि ततो नृसिंह बहे नृसिंहो हृदये नृसिंहो नृसिंहमदिं शरणं प्रपदये तव करकमलवरे नाथम् अद्भुतशृङ्गम् दलिता हिरण्यकशिपु तनुभृङ्गम् केशवधृता नरहरिरूपा जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे जय नृसिंहदेव जय नृसिंह वृंदाय तुलसी देव प्रियाय केशवस्य च विष्णु भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्यवत्यै नमो नमः वृंदाय तुलसी देव्याय प्रियाय केशवस्य च विष्णु भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्यवत्यै नमो नमः वृंदाय तुलसी देव्याय प्रियाय केशवस्य च विष्णु भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्यवत्यै नमो नमः नमो नमः तुलसी कृष्णा प्रेयसी नमो नमः राधा कृष्ण सेवा पाबो एई अभिलाषी ये तुम्हार शरण लय तारा वंशा पूर्ण कृपा करी करो तारे वृंदावन वासी मोरा विलास विलास कुंजे दियो वास नयने हेविबो सदा युगल रूप राशि ए निवेदन धर सखीरनुगत कर सेवा अधिकार दिए करो निज दासी दीन कृष्ण दासे कोय ये न मोरा होय श्री राधा गोविंदा प्रेमे सदा ये न भाति तुलसी कृष्ण प्रेयसी नमो नमः यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्मत्यादिकानि च तानि तानि प्रणश्यन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्मत्यादिकानि च तानि तानि प्रणश्यन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्मत्यादिकानि च तानि तानि प्रणश्यन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे वृंदाय तुलसी देव्यै प्रियाय केशवशच विष्णु भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्यवत्यै नमो नमः वृंदाय तुलसी देव्यै प्रियाय केशवशच विष्णु भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्यवत्यै नमो नमः वृंदाय तुलसी देव्यै प्रियाय केशवशच विष्णु भक्ति प्रदे देवी सत्यवत्यै नमो नमः श्रीमती वृंदादेवी तुलसी महारानी की yes, Canto 1, Chapter 13, Text number 37. Translation. Sanjay said, "My dear descendant of Kuru dynasty, I have no information of the determination of your two uncles and Gandhari. O king, O king, O king, I have been cheated by those great souls." Purport. That great souls cheat others may be astonishing to know, but it is a fact that great souls cheat others for a greater cause. It is said that Lord Krishna also advised Yudhishthira to tell a lie before Dronacharya, and it was also for a great cause. The Lord wanted it. The Lord wanted it, and therefore it was a great cause. Satisfaction of the Lord is the creation of one who is bona fide, and the highest perfection of life is to satisfy the Lord by one's occupational duty. That is the verdict of Gita and Bhagavatam. Dhritarashtra and Vidura, followed by Gandhari, did not disclose their determination to Sanjay, although he was constantly with Dhritarashtra as his personal assistant. Sanjay never thought that Dhritarashtra could perform any act without consulting him, but Dhritarashtra going away from home was so confidential that it could not be disclosed even to Sanjay. Sanatan Goswami also cheated the keeper of prison house while going away to see Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and similarly Raghunath Das Goswami also cheated his priest and left home for good to satisfy the Lord. To satisfy the Lord, anything is good, for it is in relationship with the absolute truth. We also had the same opportunity to cheat the family members and leave home to engage in the service of Srimad Bhagavatam. Such cheating was necessary for a great cause, and there is no loss of any party in such transcendental fraud. Text 38. While Sanjay was thus speaking, Sri Narada, the powerful devotee of the Lord, appeared on the scene carrying his tambura. Maharaj Yudhishthir and his brothers received him properly by getting up from their seat and offering obeisances. Purport. Devarshi Narada is described herein as Bhagavan due to his being the most confidential devotee of the Lord. The Lord and his very confidential devotees are treated on the same level by those who are actually engaged in the loving service of the Lord. The Lord and his very confidential devotees are treated on the same level by those who are actually engaged in the loving service of the Lord. Such confidential devotees of the Lord are very much dear to the Lord because they travel anywhere to preach the glories of the Lord in different capacities and try other utmost to convert the non-devotees of the Lord into devotees in order to bring them to the platform of sanity. Actually, a living being cannot be a non-devotee of the Lord because of his constitutional position. But when one becomes a non-devotee or non-believer, it is to be understood that the person concerned is not in a sound condition of life. The confidential devotees of the Lord treat such illusioned living beings, and therefore they are most pleasing in the eyes of the Lord. The Lord says in Bhagavad Gita that no one is dearer to him than one who actually preaches the glories of the Lord to convert the non-believers and non-devotees. Such personalities as Narada must be offered all due respects, like those offered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself. And Maharaj Yudhishthir, along with his noble brother, were examples for others in receiving a pure devotee of the Lord like Narada, who had no other business save and except singing the glories of the Lord along with his veena, a musical stringed instrument. Text 39. Translation. Maharaj Yudhishthir said, O godly personality, I do not know where my two uncles have gone, nor can I find my ascetic aunt who is grief stricken by the loss of all her sons. Purport. Maharaj Yudhishthir, as a good soul and devotee of the Lord, was always conscious of the great loss of his aunt and her suffering as an ascetic. An ascetic is never disturbed by all kind of suffering, and that make him strong and determined on the path of spiritual progress. Queen Gandhari is a typical example of an ascetic because of her marvelous character in many tiring situations. She was an ideal woman as mother, wife, ascetic, and in the history of the world, such character in a woman is rarely found. Text 40. Translation. You are like a captain of a ship in a great ocean, and you can direct us to our destination. Thus addressed, the godly personality Devarshi Narada, greatest of the philosopher devotee, began to speak. Purport. There are different types of philosopher, and the greatest of all of them are those who have seen the personality of Godhead and have surrendered themselves in the transcendental loving service of the Lord. Among all such pure devotees of the Lord, Devarshi Narada is the chief, and therefore he has been described herein as the greatest of all philosopher devotees. Unless one has been unless one has become a sufficiently learned philosopher by hearing the Vedanta philosophy from a bona fide spiritual monk, unless one has become a sufficiently learned unless one has become a sufficiently learned philosopher by hearing the Vedanta philosophy from the bona fide spiritual master, one cannot be learned philosopher devotee. One must be very faithful, learned, and renounced, otherwise one cannot be a pure devotee. A pure devotee of the Lord can give us direction toward the other end of the Nisines. Devarishi Narada used to visit the palace of Maharaj Yudhishthir because the Pandavas were all pure devotees of the Lord, and Devarishi was always ready to give them good counsel whenever needed. Text 41. Sri Narada said, O pious king, do not lament for anyone, for everyone is under the control of the Supreme Lord. Therefore, all living beings and their leaders carry on worship to be well protected. It is He only who brings them together and disperses them. Purport. Every living being, either in this material world or in the spiritual world, is under the control of the Supreme Lord, the personality of Godhead. Beginning from Brahmaji, the leader of this universe, down to the insignificant ant, all are abiding by the order of the Supreme Lord. Thus, the constitutional position of the living being is subordination under the control of the Lord. The foolish living being, especially men, artificially rebel against the law of the Supreme and thus became chastised as an asura or a lawbreaker. A living being is placed in the particular position by the order of the Supreme Lord, and he is again shifted from that place by the order of the Supreme Lord or his authorized agents. Brahma, Shiva, Indra, Chandra, Maharaj Yudhishthir, or in modern history, Napoleon, Akbar, Alexander, Gandhi, Subhash, and Nehru, all are servants of the Lord, and they are placed in and removed from their respective position by the supreme will of the Lord. None of them is independent, even though such men or leaders rebel so as not to be recognized the supremacy of the Lord, but they are put under still more rigorous law of the material world by different miseries. Only the foolish men therefore say that there is no God. Maharaj Yudhishthir was being convinced of this naked truth because he was greatly overwhelmed by the sudden departure of his old uncles and aunt. Maharaj Yudhishthira Maharaj Dhritarashtra was placed in that position according to his past deed. He had already suffered or enjoyed the benefit acquired to him in the past, but due to his good luck, somehow or other, he had a good younger brother Vidura, and by his instruction, he left to achieve salvation by closing all account in the material world. Ordinary, one cannot change the course of one's due happiness and distress by plan. Everyone has to accept them as they come under the subtle arrangement of Kala or invisible time. There is no use trying to counteract them. The best thing is therefore that one should endeavor to achieve salvation, and this prerogative is given only to man because of his developed condition of mental activities and intelligence. Only for men are there different Vedic instructions for attainment of salvation during the human form of existence. One who misuse this opportunity of advanced intelligence is verily condemned and put into different type of miseries, either in this present life or in the future. That is the way of supreme controls. That is the way the supreme controls everyone. Text 42. Translation. As a cow bound through the nose by a long rope is conditioned, so also human beings are bound by different Vedic injunctions and are conditioned to obey the orders of the Supreme. Purport. Every living being, whether a man, animal, bird, thinks that he is free by himself, but actually no one is free from the severe law of the Lord. The laws of the Lord are severe because they cannot be disobeyed in any circumstances. The man-made laws The man-made laws may be evaded by cunning outlaws, but in the courts of the supreme lawmaker, there is not the slightest possibility of neglecting the laws. A slight change in the course of God-made law can bring about a massive danger to be faced by the lawbreaker. Such laws of the Supreme are generally known as the code of religion under different conditions, but the principle of religion everywhere is one and the same, namely, obey the orders of the Supreme Lord, the codes of the religion. That is the condition of material existence. All living beings in this material world have taken up the risk of conditioned life by their own selection and are thus entrapped by the laws of material nature. The only way to get out of the entanglement is to agree to obey the Supreme. But instead of becoming free from the clutches of Maya or illusion, foolish human beings become bound up by the different nomenclature, being designated as Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Sudra, Hindu, Mohammedan, Indian, European, American, Chinese, and many other. And thus they carry out the order of the Supreme Lord under the influence of respective scriptural or legislative injunctions. The statutory law of the state are imperfect imitation replica of the religious code. The secular state or the godless state allows the citizen to break the laws of the God but restrict them from disobeying the laws of the state. The result is that people in general suffer more by breaking the laws of the god than by obeying the imperfect laws made by the men. Every man is imperfect by constitution. Every man is imperfect by constitution under the conditions of material existence, and there is not the least possibility that even the most materially advanced man can enact perfect legislation. On the other hand, there is no such imperfection in the laws of God. If leaders are educated in the laws of God, there is no necessity of the makeshift legislative council of aimless men. There is necessity of change in the makeshift law of men, but there is no change in the God-made law because they are made perfect by the all-perfect personality of Godhead. The codes of religion, scriptural injunctions are made by liberated representative of God in consideration of different conditions of living, and by carrying out the orders of the Lord, the conditioned living being gradually become free from the clutches of the material existence. The factual position of the living being is, however, that he is the eternal servitor of the Supreme Lord. In this liberated state, he renders service to the Lord in transcendental love and thus enjoys a life of full freedom, even sometimes on the equal level with the Lord, or sometimes more than the Lord. But in the conditioned material world, every living being wants to be the lord of other living being, and thus by the illusion of Maya, this mentality of lording it over becomes the cause of further extension of conditioned life. So, in the material world, the living being is still more conditioned until he surrendered unto the Lord by reviving his original state of eternal relationship, eternal servitorship. This is the last instruction of Bhagavad Gita and all other recognized scriptures of the world. Text 43. As a player sets up and disperses his plaything according to his own sweet will, so the supreme will of the Lord brings men together and separates them. Purport. We must know for certain that the particular position in which we are now set up is an arrangement of the supreme will in terms of our own act in the past. The Supreme Lord is present as the localized Paramatma in the heart of every living being, as it is said in Bhagavad Gita, and therefore he knows everything of our activities in every stages of life. He rewards the reactions of our actions by placing us in some particular place. A rich man gets his son born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but the child who came as a rich man's son deserved such a place, and therefore he is placed there by the will of the Lord. At a particular moment when the child has to be removed from that place, he is also carried by the will of the Supreme, even if the child or father does not wish to be separated from the happy relation. The same thing happens in the case of poor men also. Neither rich man nor poor man has any control over such meetings or separation of living beings. The example of a player and his playthings should not be misunderstood. One may argue that since the Lord is bound to reward the reactionary result of our own action, the example of player cannot be applied. But it is not so. We must always remember that the Lord is the supreme will and he is not bound by any law. Generally, the law of karma is that one is awarded the result of one's own action, but in special cases, by the will of the Lord, such resultant actions are changed also. But this change can be affected by the will of the Lord only and no other. Therefore, the example of players cited in this verse is quite appropriate, for the Supreme Will is absolutely free to do whatever he likes, and because he is all perfect, there is no mistake in any of his actions or reactions. These changes of resultant actions are specially rendered by the Lord when a pure devotee is involved. It is assured in the Bhagavad Gita that the Lord saves a pure devotee who has surrendered unto him without reservation from all sort of reactions of sin, and there is no doubt about this. There are hundreds of examples of reactions changed by the Lord in the history of the world. If Lord is able to change the reactions of one's past deed, then certainly he is not himself bound by any action or reaction of his own deeds. He is perfect and transcendental to all laws. Text 44. Translation. O King, in all circumstances, whether you consider the soul to be an eternal principle, or the material body to be perishable, or everything to exist in the impersonal absolute truth, or everything to be an inexplicable combination of matter and spirit, feelings of separation are due only to illusory affection and nothing more. Purport. The actual fact is that every living being is an individual part and parcel of the Supreme Being, and his constitutional position is subordinate cooperative service. Either in his conditional material existence or in his liberated position of full knowledge and eternity, the living being is eternally under the control of the Supreme Lord. But those who are not conversant with factual knowledge put forward many speculative prepositions about the real position of the living entity. It is admitted, however, by all schools of philosophy that the living being is eternal and that the covering body of the five material element is perishable and temporary. The eternal living entity transmigrates from one material body to another by the law of karma, and material bodies are perishable by their fundamental structures. Therefore, there is nothing to be lamented in the case of souls being transferred into another body or the material bodies perishing at the certain stage. There are others also who believe in the merging of the spirit soul in the supreme spirit when it is uncovered by the material engagement, and there are others also who do not believe in the existence of spirit or soul but believe in tangible matter. In our daily experience, we find so many transformation of matter from one form to another, but we do not lament such changing features. In either of the above cases, the force of divine energy is uncheckable. No one has any hand in it, and thus there is no cause of grief. Text 45. Translation. Therefore, give up your anxiety due to ignorance of the self. You are now thinking of how they, who are helpless, poor creature, will exist without you. Purport. When we think of our kith and kin as being helpless and dependent on us, it is all due to ignorance. Every living creature is allowed all protection by the order of the Supreme Lord in terms of each one's acquired position in the world. The Lord is known as Bhuta Bhrita, one who gives protection to all living beings. One should discharge his duties only, for no one but the Supreme Lord can give protection to anyone else. This is explained more clearly in the following verses. Text 46. This gross material body made of five elements is already under the control of eternal time, kala, action, karma, and the mode of material nature, guna. How then, how then can it, being already in the jaws of serpent, protect others? Purport. The world's movement for freedom through politics, economics, social and cultural propaganda can do not benefit can do no benefit to anyone, for they are controlled by the superior power. A conditioned living being is under the full control of material nature, represented by eternal time and activities under the dictation of different modes of nature. There are three material modes of nature, namely goodness, passion, and ignorance. Unless one is situated in the mode of goodness, one cannot see things as they are. The passionate and the ignorant cannot even see things as they are. Therefore, a person who is passionate and ignorant cannot direct his activities on the right path. Only the man in the quality of goodness can help to certain extent. Most persons are passionate and ignorant, and therefore their plans and projects can hardly do any good to others. Above the mode of nature is eternal time, which is called Kala because it changes the shape of everything in the material world. Even if we are able to do something temporarily beneficial, time will see that the good project is frustrated in due course of time. The only thing possible to be done is to get rid of the eternal time Kala, which is compared to Kala Sarpa or the cobra snake whose bite is always lethal. No one can be saved from the bite of a cobra. The best remedy for getting out of the clutches of cobra like Kala or its integrity, the modes of nature, is Bhakti Yoga as it is recommended in the Bhagavad Gita 14.26. The highest perfectional project of philanthropic activities is to engage everyone in the act of preaching Bhakti Yoga all over the world because that alone can save the people from the control of Maya or the material nature represented by Kala Karma Guna as described above. The Bhagavad Gita 14.26 confirms this definitely. Next, text 47. Translation. Those who are devoid of hands are prey for those who have hands. Those devoid of legs are prey for the four-legged. The weak are the substance of the strong, and the general rule holds that one living being is food for another. Purport. A systematic law of subsistence is the struggle of existence is there by the supreme will, and there is no escape for anyone by any amount of planning. The living beings who have come to the material world against the will of the Supreme Being are under the control of the supreme power called Maya Shakti, the deputed agent of the Lord, and this Devi Maya is meant to pinch the conditioned soul by threefold miseries, one of which is explained here is in this verse. The weak are the subsistence of the strong. No one is strong enough to protect himself from the onslaught of the stronger, and by the will of the Lord there are systematic categories of the weak, the stronger, and the strongest. There is nothing to be lamented if a tiger eats a weaker animal, including a man, because that is the law of Supreme Lord. But although the law states that a human being must subsist on another living being, there is a law of good sense also, for the human being is meant to obey the law of the scriptures. This is impossible for other animals. The human being is meant for self-realization, and for that purpose he is not to eat anything which is not first offered to the Lord. The Lord accepts from his devotees all kind of food prepared made of vegetables, fruits, leaves and grains. Fruits, leaves and milk is different variety can be offered to the Lord, and after the Lord accepts the food stuff, the devotee fruit, leaves and milk in different varieties can be offered to the Lord. Fruit, leaves and milk in different varieties can be offered to the Lord, and after the Lord accepts the food stuff, the devotee can partake of the prasad. The devotee can partake of prasad, by which all the suffering in the struggle of existence will be gradually mitigated. This is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita 9.26. Even those who are accustomed to eat animals can offer foodstuff not to the Lord directly but to the agent of the Lord under certain condition of religious rites. Injunctions of the scriptures are meant not to encourage the eaters of animal but to restrict them by regulative principle. The living being is the source of subsistence for other stronger living beings. No one should be very anxious for his subsistence in any circumstances, because there are living beings everywhere and no living being starves for want of food at any place. Maharaj Yudhishthir is advised by Narada not to worry about his uncle's suffering for want of food, for they could live on vegetable available in the jungle as prasad of the Supreme Lord, and thus realizes the path of salvation. Exploitation of the weaker living being by the stronger is the natural law of existence. There is always an attempt to devour the weak in the different kingdoms of living being. There is no possibility of checking this tendency by any artificial mean under material condition. It can be checked only by awakening the spiritual sense of the human being by practice of spiritual regulation. The spiritual regulative principles, however, do not allow a man to slaughter weaker animal on one side and teach other peaceful coexistence. If man does not allow the animal if man does not allow the animal's peaceful coexistence, how can he expect peaceful existence in human society? The blind leaders must therefore understand the Supreme Being and then try to implement the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God, or Ram Rajya, is impossible without the awakening of God consciousness in the mass mind of the people of the world. Text 48. Therefore, O King, you should look to the Supreme Lord only, who is one without a second, and who manifests himself by different energies, is both within and without. Purport. The Supreme Lord personality of Godhead is one without a second, but he manifests himself by different energies because he is by nature blissful. The living being are also manifestation of his marginal energy, qualitatively one with the Lord, and there are innumerable living beings both within and without the external and internal energies of the Lord. Since the spiritual world is a manifestation of Lord's internal energy, the living being within that internal potency are qualitatively one with the Lord without contamination from the external potency. Although qualitatively one with the Lord, the living being, due to contamination of the material world, is pervertedly manifested, and therefore he experiences so-called happiness and distress in the material world.
Next Maharaj, I am leaving for Jagannath Puri Maharaj. No, Maharaj. Yes, sir, Maharaj. 9. Yes, Maharaj. 9:30 the flight, Maharaj.
नहीं शेड्यूल क्या है हमारा?
Meeting is tomorrow, Maharaj, but I will reach today.
The meeting is tomorrow.
Yes, sir, Maharaj.
Today.
Not today.
Tomorrow ICC.
ICC meeting, just for 2 days.
2 days ICC meeting.
Yeah, third day I think they are going to have some retreat, but I won't be there for that. I will come back on second morning.
2 days ICC.
ICC only.
Not IIC.
No, no, it's only ICC.
The president.
Several presidents and yeah, of course, they can propose him there. Yeah, of course. Secretary Maharaj, Smrita Ghosh, Keshav Murari Bro, and Sahadev Bro, the chairman. Yes, yes, yeah. They discuss many things which should be done in private. Now they're discussing Gaur Gopal. Yeah, he doesn't speak about Krishna. So Chopati Maharaj is most popular speaker. So he doesn't speak anything about Krishna. So yeah, they say it's brief preaching, but they come with a strong objection for that. He's saying he should come in normal trousers and should not wear saffron. It's not speaking about Krishna. But they are saying it's a brief preaching and gradually coming down, taking them to Krishna consciousness. Yeah. Yeah, that's what everybody knows. Many of them are not coming also, like Pancharatma is not coming, Bhakti Purushottam Society is not coming. Yeah, Pancharatma. Some of them are not coming. Yeah, actually, Maharaj, the festival, Rath Yatra festival is not over, that's going to be crowded. It's going to be a big mess. I don't know why they have kept it fully. It's raining as well as crowded. Today the Ulta Rath yesterday happened, and today they will have Sonar Way. The Raths will be there on the road. Lord Jagannath will be dressed with all golden ornaments. Yeah. Yes, I have. No pickup. We have to pay. And we have to stay in guest house and all those things.
Krishna's face.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Maharaj. Heart is better. Please take care. Thank you, Maharaj. Please bless. Yes, no? No, I can't go alone. I can't leave the bag and all this. I have my assistant also there. Yes, no?
The perception of such ephemeral happiness and distresses is due only to the forgetfulness of his qualities, which are equal to Lord's. There is, however, a regular current from the Lord himself, from within and without, by which to rectify the fallen condition of the living being. From within, he corrects the desiring living beings as localized Paramatma, and from without, he corrects by his manifestation the spiritual master and the revealed scriptures. One should look unto the Lord. One should not be disturbed by the so-called manifestations of happiness or distress, but he should try to cooperate with the Lord in his outward activities for correcting the fallen soul. By his order only, one should become a spiritual master and cooperate with the Lord. One should not become a spiritual master for one's personal benefit, for some material gain, or as in revenue of business or occupation for earning livelihood. Bona fide spiritual masters who look unto the Supreme Lord to cooperate with him are actually qualitatively one with the Lord, and the forgetful one are perverted reflection only. Yudhishthira Maharaj is advised by Narada, therefore, not to be disturbed by the affairs of so-called happiness and distress, but to look only unto the Lord to execute the mission for which the Lord has descended. That was his prime duty. Text 49. Translation. That Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Shri Krishna, in the guise of all-devouring time, Kala Rupa, has now descended on earth to eliminate the envious from the world. Purport. There are two classes of human beings, namely the envious and the obedient. Since the Supreme Lord is one and the Father of all living beings, the envious living beings are also his son, but they are known as asuras. But the living beings who are obedient to the Supreme Father are called devatas or demigod, because they are not contaminated by the material conception of life. Not only are the asura envious of the Lord in even denying the existence of the Lord, but they are also envious of all other living beings. The predominance of asuras in the world is occasionally rectified by the Lord when he eliminates them from the world and establishes a rule of devata like the Pandavas. His designation as Kala in disguise is significant. He is not at all dangerous, but he is the transcendental form of eternity, knowledge and bliss. For the devotees, his factual form is disclosed, and for the non-devotees, he appears like Kala Rupa, which is casual form. This casual form of the Lord is not at all pleasing to the Asura, and therefore they think of the Lord as formless in order to feel secure that they will not be vanquished by the Lord. Text 50, translation. The Lord has already performed his duties to help the demigods, and he is awaiting the rest. You, Pandava, may wait as long as the Lord is here on earth. Purport. The Lord descends from his abode, Krishna Loka, the topmost planet in the spiritual sky, in order to help the demigod administer of this material world when they are greatly vexed by the Asura, who are envious not only of the Lord but also of his devotees. As referred to above, the conditioned living beings contact material association by their own choice, dictated by a strong desire to lord it over the resources of the material world and become imitation lord of all they survey. Everyone is trying to become a imitation god. There is a keen competition among such imitation gods, and such competitors are generally known as asuras. When there are too many asuras in the world, then it becomes a hell for those who are devotees of the Lord. Due to the growth of the asura, the mass of the people who are generally devoted to the Lord by nature and the pure devotees of the Lord, including the demigods in the higher planet, prays to the Lord for relief, and the Lord either descends personally from his abode or deputes some of his devotees to remodel the fallen conditions of the human society or even animal society. Such disruptions take place not only in human society but also among animals, birds, and other living beings, including the demigods in the higher planets. Lord Shri Krishna descended personally to vanquish Asura like Kansa, Jarasandha, and Shishupal, and during the reign of Maharaj Yudhishthira, almost all these Asuras were killed by the Lord. Now he was awaiting the annihilation of his own dynasty, called the Yadu Vansha, who appeared by his will in this world. He wanted to take them away before his own departure to his eternal abode. Narada, like Vidura, did not disclose the imminent annihilation of the Yadu dynasty, but indirectly gave a hint to the king and his brother to wait till the incident happened and the Lord departed. Text 51. O king, your uncle Dhritarashtra, his brother Vidura, and his wife Gandhari have gone to the southern side of Himalaya mountain where there are shelters of the great sages. Purport. To pacify the mourning Maharaj Yudhishthira, Narad first of all spoke from the philosophical point of view, and then he began to describe the future movements of his uncle, which he could see by his foreseeing power, and thus began to describe as follows. Text 52. The place is called Shaptashrota, divided by 7, because there are waters of sacred Ganges. Because there the water of the sacred Ganges were divided into 7 branches. This was done for the satisfaction of the 7 great rishis. Text 53. On the banks at Shaptashrota, Dhritarashtra is now engaged in beginning Ashtanga Yoga by bathing 3 times daily in the morning, noon, and evening, by performing the Agnihotra sacrifice with fire, and by drinking water only. This helps one control the mind and senses and frees one completely from the thoughts of familial affection. Purport. The yoga system is a mechanical way to control the senses and the mind and divert them from matter to spirit. The preliminary processes are the sitting posture, meditation, spiritual thoughts, manipulation of air passing within the body, and gradual situation in trance facing the absolute person Paramatma. Such mechanical way of rising to the spiritual platform prescribes some regulative principle of taking bath 3 times daily, fasting as far as possible, sitting and concentrating the mind on spiritual matters, and thus gradually become free from Vishaya or material objectives. Material existence means to be absorbed in the material objective, which is simply illusory. House, Country, family, society, children, property, and business are some of the material covering of the spirit Atma, and the yoga system helps one to become free from all these illusory thoughts and gradually turn towards the absolute person Paramatma. By material association and education, we learn simply to concentrate on flimsy things, but yoga is a process of forgetting them altogether. Modern so-called yogis and yoga system manifest some magical feats, and ignorant person are attracted by such false things, or they accept the yoga system as a cheap healing process for disease of the gross body. But factually, the yoga system is the process of learning to forget what we have acquired throughout the struggle of existence. Dhritarashtra was all alone engaged in improving family affairs by raising the standard of living of his sons and by usurping the property of the Pandava for the sake of his own son. These are common affair of a man grossly materialistic and without knowledge of the spiritual force. He does not see how this can drag one from heaven to hell. By the grace of his younger brother Vidura, Dhritarashtra was enlightened and could see his grossly illusioned engagement, and by such enlightenment he was able to leave home for spiritual realization. Sri Narada Dev was just foretelling the way of his spiritual progress in a place which was sanctified by the flow of the celestial Ganges. Drinking water only without solid food is also considered fasting. This is necessary for advancement of spiritual knowledge. A foolish man wants to be a cheap yogi without observing the regulative principles. A man who has no control over the tongue at first can hardly become a yogi. Yogi and bhogi are two opposite terms. The bhogi or the merry man who eats and drinks cannot be a yogi, for a yogi is never allowed to eat and drink unrestrictedly. We may note with profit how Dhritarashtra began his yoga system by drinking water only and sitting calmly in a place with a spiritual atmosphere, deeply absorbed in thoughts of Lord Hari, the personality of Godhead. Text 54. Translation. One who has controlled the sitting posture, the yogic asana, and the breathing process can turn the senses toward the absolute personality of Godhead and thus become immune to the contamination of the modes of material nature, namely mundane goodness, passion, and ignorance. Purport. The preliminary activities of the way of yoga are asana, pranayam, pratyahar, dhyan, dharana, etc. Maharaj Dhritarashtra was to attain success in those preliminary actions because he was seated in a sanctified place and was concentrating upon one objective, namely the Supreme Personality of Godhead Hari. Thus, all his senses were being engaged in the service of the Lord. This process directly helps the devotee to get freedom from the contamination of the three material modes of nature. Even the highest mode, the material mode of goodness, is also a cause of material bondage, and what to speak of other qualities, namely passion and ignorance. Passion, passion and ignorance increase the material propensities of hankering for material enjoyment, and a strong sense of lust provokes the accumulation of wealth and power. One who has conquered these two base mentalities and has raised himself one who has conquered these two base mentalities and has raised himself to the platform of goodness, which is full of knowledge and morality, cannot also control the senses, namely the eyes, tongue, nose, ear, and touch. But one who has surrendered himself unto the lotus feet of the Lord Hari, as above mentioned, can transcend all influences of modes of material nature and be fixed in the service of the Lord. The Bhakti Yoga process therefore directly applies the senses to the loving service of the Lord. This prohibits the beginner from engaging in material activities. The process of turning the senses from material attachment to the loving transcendental service of the Lord is called pratyahara. The very process is called pranayama, ultimately ending in samadhi or absorption in pleasing the Supreme Lord Hari by all means. Text 55, translation. Dhritarashtra will have to amalgamate his pure identity with intelligence and then merge into the Supreme Being with knowledge of his qualitative oneness as a living entity with the Supreme Brahman. Being freed from the blocked sky, he will have to rise to the spiritual sky. Purport. The living being, by his desiring to lord it over the material world and declining to cooperate with the Supreme Lord, contacts the sum total of the material world, namely the Mahat Tattva, and from the Mahat Tattva his false identity with the material world, intelligence, mind and senses is developed. This covers his pure spiritual identity. By the yogic process, when his pure identity is realized in self-realization, one has to revert to the original position by amalgamating the 5 gross elements and the subtle elements, mind and the intelligence, into the Mahat Tattva again. Thus, getting free from the clutches of Mahat Tattva, Thus, getting free from the clutches of Mahat Tattva, he has to merge in the existence of Super Soul. In other words, he has to realize the qualitatively that he is non-different from the Super Soul, and thus he transcends the material sky by his pure identical intelligence, and thus become engaged in the transcendental loving service of the Lord. This is the highest perfectional development of spiritual identity, which was attained by Dhritarashtra by the grace of Vidura and the Lord. The Lord's mercy was bestowed upon him by his personal contact with Vidura, and when he was actually practicing the instructions of Vidura, the Lord helped him to attain the highest perfectional stage. A pure devotee of the Lord does not live on any planet of the material sky, nor does he feel any contact with the material elements. His so-called material body does not exist, being surcharged with the spiritual current of Lord's identical interest, and thus he is permanently freed from all contaminations of the sum total of Mahat Tattva. He is always in the spiritual sky, which he attains by being transcendental to the sevenfold material coverings by the effect of his devotional service. The conditioned soul are within the coverings, whereas the liberated soul is far beyond the cover. Text 56, translation. Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare Jai Radha Patupati Radha Patupati Radha Jai Lalita Visakha Jai Lalita Visakha Lalita Visakha Jai Lalita Visakha Jai Sitaram 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 Lakshmana Jai Gauranitai Gauranitai
अच्छा बारिश हो रहा है।
जय कृष्ण बलराम गिरिराज महाराज जय गिरिराज महाराज जय जगन्नाथ बलदेव सुभद्रा जय सुदर्शन जय उग्र नरसिंह जय गिरिराज बाबा की जय कृष्ण बलराम जय भैया की जय जगन्नाथ की जय सुभद्रा सुदर्शन की जय कृष्ण उग्र नरसिंह देव की जय प्रहलाद लक्ष्मण देव की जय कृष्ण बलराम की जय जय हरि शनि एकादशी महाराज की जय जय कृष्ण
दर्शन कीजिए एकादशी का भगवान के चरण नरसिंह अनंत शेष दामोदर बलराम चरण डॉक्टर भगवान धन्वंतरी से रक्षा सबकी रक्षा करे। कृष्ण बलराम नरसिंह देव नारायण शिला कुर्मा हरिनगर गिरिराज बाबा जय कृष्ण बलराम जगन्नाथ बलदेव सुभद्रा सुदर्शन निताय गौर सुंदर।